right, hello, can you hear me?
Wait.
Can you turn up the volume for this mic? Testing.
Hello, hello.
Hello. Testing. Is this better? Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming to our Rethinking Economics event. Before we get started with the panel, I wanted to do a short activity. So for the audience that's present in the room, can you raise your hand if you've ever taken an economics class? Yeah, most of the room. Raise your hand if you were familiar with any of this diversity of schools of economic thought, which you can see behind you, some of these. So if you are familiar with any of these. Okay, that's a good number. Raise your hand if you knew that most economics 101 courses that you take are primarily influenced by neoclassical economics. Wow, UVM is great.
Well, I guess we have a really learned audience here, which is awesome. But yeah, so as you can see in the diagram above our heads, we have neoclassical economics, which is considered the mainstream school of economic thought. So all your Econ 101, micro and macroeconomics come from that foundation. Usually it might not be made explicit in your courses, but if you go through like some history of economics, you kind of will learn that. But then you have all the other ones, which are considered heterodox schools of economics. Heterodox means outside of the orthodoxy, so outside of the mainstream, if you will. And yeah, so the whole point here of the discussion is to like bring awareness to those and to see how we can collaborate, among the different schools. And the main question that we should be asking ourselves is, should these heterodox schools be outside of the mainstream, right? Where do they fit? So with that being said, I'm gonna introduce the event formally. First of all, we are the Rethinking Economics UVM chapter, which is part of the international network of Rethinking Economics, which was established in 2011 in the United Kingdom in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And a lot of the movement has been inspired by what they perceive the lack of awareness by conventional economics to predict, if you will, the financial crisis. So that has led to many chapters being established around the world. This program, the network is very well established in Europe, and we are working now to establish it more in the United States. It's also established in other parts of the world. You can go on the website and you can see all the groups listed from different universities around the world. So the Rethinking Economics UVM chapter is part of this bigger umbrella, and it aims to foster diversity of economic thought among the UVM community and beyond by enabling co-learning and pluralistic economic education to help us work towards well-being economies that are sustainable, just, and efficient. So the aim of this panel is to provide an initial push for dialogue among interested faculty, students, and staff to discuss how we can co-learn and educate about this diversity of economic thought to improve our own understanding, and so we can actually, as students and policy advisors, help address the social and ecological crisis of our time. So with that being said, next thing will be to introduce our amazing panelists. I have to not forget to have the microphone in my mouth the whole time. So first of all, we have here 5 amazing faculty who have been at UVM for a variety of times. But what if we start with each one of you introducing yourselves and just telling us what led you to study economics in the first place, and why do you choose to your particular school of economic thought?
Okay, this is working. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Donna Ramirez-Harrington from the Economics Department. I've been here since 2007, and I teach environmental economics. I fell in love with econ in high school. Just made the world made sense after learning economics. But to talk about this, what school of thought, I don't know any other flavor back then. I'm not going to tell you the year. I know you can do the math, but I did not know any other flavor of econ. Now it's, it's called mainstream economics. But how did I get into the environmental economics? The only two concentrations back in the University of the Philippines, where I studied undergrad, was development economics and environmental economics. And I gravitated towards environmental and natural resource. My dad was a professor of forestry, and he was working as a consultant with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources with a team of other economists. And he was like, oh, dang, I wish I had an econ background. And I was like, that's it. That's it. We can work together. We'd never had a chance to. But from the get-go, my economics point of view and training, I've always thought of trying to apply those principles for environment and natural resources. So that's how, and I've been doing that since. So that's how it came to econ and environmental econ.
All right. Hi, I'm Trisha Shrum. I'm a assistant professor at the Community Development and Applied Economics Department. And I got interested in economics in undergrad. I was actually studying to become an ecologist. And I took it was actually a macroeconomics class, and I just was really fascinated with how economics was able to boil down really complex things into models that felt a bit more tractable, that you were able to kind of boil it down and upon which people could actually maybe make decisions, maybe understand something. So coming from ecology and environmental science, I was really just interested in, I've always been interested in saving the planet, more or less, and working in the environmental space. And I've been looking for the best ways to do that. So I've been picking up various tools. After deciding I wanted to shift from being an ecologist to an economist, I realized that, or at least I thought, that if I were an economist, then that's what makes people listen. I was also an activist in my undergrad, and you spend your whole life trying to get people to make better decisions regarding the environment. And I thought, oh, here's this beautiful idea of externalities. There's this beautiful mechanisms of economics, and everyone listens to economists. Turns out that's not entirely true. But yeah, so I got into environmental economics. I went to grad school. My advisors were environmental economists and one behavioral economist and one non-economist, so more of a behavioral scientist. So I started early on and have continued to take a really broad disciplinary view on my work. And I like to use the tools of economics and some of the frameworks of economics to solve problems that I care about related to the environment.
I'm Josh Farley. I'm a professor in CDAE. And I did an undergrad degree in biology, but went on to do a master's in international development. And I learned actually how much harm you can do in international development. So I thought before I pursued that field, I should get, more background. And my favorite professor suggested I study economics. And I had no clue what economics was about. But foolishly, I suppose, Cornell accepted me with a full ride. And my first semester there, I learned that mainstream economics, it was at the height of the neoliberal era. I thought mainstream economics was not grounded in science and had kind of appalling ethics. And I was ready to quit the program, but my first semester there, I got a fellowship to spend a year in Brazil, explicitly not to study economics. And when I was down there, the president of the university in Brasilia, went on to become quite well-known politician. He told me about ecological economics, and I devoured, the books of George Roygan and Herman Daly, and came back really excited to be an ecological economist. And my committee told me, that's crap. If you study that, you'll never get a job, you'll never get a publication. And my thought was, if I study what you want me to study, I'll never enjoy a job. And they literally told me that if I wanted to get a PhD, I had to write what they believed, not what I believed. But I wrote to Herman Daly and told him, I was very frustrated. I wanted to be an ecological economist. How do I do it? He said, finish your degree and call yourself one. And so that's basically what I did. And, I find this field really does pursue the right ends of a socially just sustainability transition, very well grounded in the laws of physics and ecology. I think it's a field that the world desperately needs right now, is our current economic system drives us towards suicide, probably.
I'm Stephanie Seguino. I'm professor emeritus from the economics department. I think that the origin of my work in economics really developed in part from being the granddaughter of 4 immigrant grandparents who struggled, and understanding that poverty is not the result of a failure to work hard and have good values and so forth. And it was really reinforced when I went to live in Haiti for 5 years and saw the relationship between poverty and deforestation and ecological destruction. And I think, in a different time period, that we might have resorted to moral philosophy to address the problems that we face today. But one of the things that I've always been is very strategic, and the language today is the language of economics and finance, and one has to be able to respond to what was the mantra that I heard when I was an undergraduate, and that is that liberals had bleeding hearts, that it was nice to care about other people, but it was not logical or rational to do so. And I sought to disprove that, and I think I've done that for 27 years, and I'll continue.
Hi, folks. Yeah, I mean, I just sort of stumbled into economics, to be honest with you. I went to school to be an alpine ski racer, and economics and business classes were in the evening, and science and math were in the mornings. I wanted to ski in the mornings, so I took economics and business, and then just kind of kept on that road, but always in my heart of hearts wanted to study science, wanted to study ecology, wanted to study ethics. So I ended up in grad school at Cornell. Similar story, just because someone paid me to go to grad school. I was like, cool, I didn't even know that was a thing. And Josh and I crossed paths there. That's barely on a softball game, I think once. I said, pick the big guy for our team. And I stumbled upon a book in a free book pile that had ecology, economics, and ethics in the title by Herman Daly. And I was like, wow, someone is pulling these things together. And I was taking classes on all 3 and feeling very, very confused. And so I think that day I declared myself an ecological economist while in grad school, not afterwards, and went into my professor's office and said, this is what I am now. And he said, great, prove it. Write the chapter to the end of my economics textbook, which I did, and haven't looked back since.
Thank you for that. And yeah, just so many varied paths to this. I realized I forgot to introduce myself, and neither did Rigo. So I'm Rubena Anjum. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Community Development and Applied Economics department. And Rigo, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, so we get so excited about these kind of things that we forget who we are. At least that happens to me. I'm Rigo Melgar, and I'm I guess the president of our UVM and PhD candidate in ecological economics.
Well, thank you, Rigo. So yeah, I wanted to provide some context. So it's no secret that today we're facing all of these major issues. So it's like a multitude of socio-ecological problems. So climate change, inequality, and other ecological collapse, to name a few. And the way policy and I guess the academy has evolved is, at least at UVM, we see it's like very interdisciplinary. So trying to bring science and economics and social sciences together. So what do you think about the place that economics has in addressing these major problems that we see today, and how does it really impact people's lives directly? For anyone.
I mean,
Oh, sorry. So what is the place of economics in addressing some of these problems, combining with, other disciplines, and how does it directly impact people's lives?
I can start, I mean, I really look at economics. It's how people interact, how we interact with society and nature to satisfy our material needs. Without economics, we're all dead. So it's pretty important, across the board, whatever your economics are. And we are now facing these incredible challenges that have long been ignored by mainstream economics. They've been treated as things like climate change and biodiversity loss. The most important issues we face are treated by mainstream economics as externalities, external to your economic analysis. And if the most important issues we face are external to your economic theories, that suggests your economic theories are outdated and need to be changed and adjusted. So I think if we fail to change our system to tackle the most important challenges, we're kind of doomed. And as I say to all my students, if what you learn in an economics class doesn't help you understand reality, it's useless. And if it's contradicted by reality, it's wrong. And we have to make economics very applied, very useful to help navigate these challenges we currently face.
Many of you may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which suggests that the primordial problem for us is to solve the material problem of shelter and food and so forth. And only once that is solved can we move to higher levels of social engagement, self-actualization, and so forth. So in my view, that's why economics is fundamental, that we have to solve that problem first. I would say that said, what I find is a main deficiency of mainstream economics is the failure to understand that we are also social beings. So most economists don't read in sociology, they don't read in psychology. They see this sort of individual who wants to maximize whatever they consume, but fails to understand that we are relational beings, that our well-being is determined not only by how we are doing, but also how others are doing. And in that regard, I'll tell you that many of my students at UVM have told me that the topic which I study most is the problem of inequality, that they've never had a class, an economics class that discusses inequality until they get to the senior level in one of my classes. And I think that when we speak about the major challenges we face today, there are two primary challenges, the environmental challenge and the problem with inequality, and they're both related. And I failed to find a macroeconomics textbook that sufficiently addresses those. But just to say more specifically about inequality, inequality is a social problem, right? The extent that you are at the bottom of the distribution, you are socially excluded. And to the extent that you are socially excluded, it's possible for those in power to otherize you, to make it seem as though you are deficient, and therefore your poverty is your own fault. And in so doing, it dehumanizes us. I'll just tell you a brief story, if I may, that I think maybe the most impactful experience I had in my life was when I first arrived in Haiti. I was a student intern working for USAID, and a Jeep picked me up at the airport and drove me downtown to the embassy. And to get to the embassy, we had to drive through La Saline, which is an extraordinarily impoverished area. And in that area, there were literally mountains of garbage that were baking in the 95-degree weather. And there were children and adults bathing in sewers. It was so bad that you had to roll the windows up and you couldn't breathe that. And what you would find if you talk to the Haitian elite was that they didn't really see these people as people. And it partly comes from an ideology that somehow if you're poor, it's your fault. And I think that mainstream economics doesn't really help us understand that the problem of poverty is a policy choice that is often the result of policies by elites that in fact garner more resources for themselves and exclude people that they otherize or describe as less valuable, less human, less deserving, and justify that system And that is the system that you all and we all live in today. And it's one of the reasons that inequality is a solvable problem, but we have come nowhere close to beginning to address it.
I'd like to add on to what Stephanie and Josh said about the role of economics. It's about social beings and about our role in society. And that's exactly what we do. At the core of economics, being a social science, are the individuals and the people, right? And so just exactly what Josh was saying is like, how do we operate? How do we structure ourselves in society? And how do we make choices? And among those choices that we made, we have to do those choices. We have to make those decisions in the phase of scarcity, scarce resources, whether those are physical resources, capital, man-made, political power, you name it. Just like I think what Stephanie was implying is part of that is not just tangible resources, but other things as well. And it's I'm sorry to hear that your experience in grad school was very unfortunate. That is not, I mean, nobody's gonna get away with that anymore with our but I'm sorry to hear that. I did not know that. But I just wanted to add something more and to clarify about what they said. The term externalities in what they call mainstream economics does not mean it's external to our decision making, right? It's not mean that it's not taken into account in the field of economics. It's externalities because the mainstream economics differentiates between individual choices that are sometimes not consistent with what is best for society. That is not to say we're discounting altruism altogether. Of course, a lot of us make sacrifices in our individual lives that would also benefit other people, even though it's slightly inconvenient for us. And so the term externalities just happen to be used as a term, right? That's something that is outside the market system, that is not incorporated in the price system. So it's external to any transaction. You buy a price of gasoline, you buy a gallon of gasoline, the price reflects the cost of producing that good. But right now, we don't have a carbon tax. It does not reflect the price to other people, to future generations, and everybody else in society. So both from a spatial and intertemporal sense, it does not take into account what we call others, but it's just external to the market transaction. That, however, does not mean that economics does not have the tools to account for society, for social well-being, for welfare, for poverty, inequality, environmental degradation, and social justice. We have fields in environmental econ, public econ, labor economics of marriage, economics of crime, you name it, we have it. But underlying all those things is choices that individuals make in the face of scarcity or any constraint that would actually prohibit them, right, from making the choices that they want. But then also is central to mainstream economics is the social part, is that we have the policy tools. We would like to institute or induce behavioral change such that individual decisions would align with what is best for society, whether it's in the form of social justice or inequality, environmental degradation. That's the objective. And so to mischaracterize economics as being self-centered and as being, you know, everything else is external is actually not complete, and it's just that's a mischaracterization of the field. And then another thing that if I may just say, a lot of other problems that we see, inequality, and I'm just taking issue with the fact that I think maybe for a lot of the audience, maybe because it's so convenient, economics as a discipline is different from the economic system that we live in. Economics as a discipline is the one where we study how people make choices in the face of scarcity, in the face of any other constraints. Economic system is what determines what those priorities are and how we're going to make the allocation rules around different competing interests. So to conflate economics with the economic system is going to lead us to a lot of the potential differences in point of view that we think really separates a lot of us here, right? I think there's a lot more that unites us. So we need to conflate that where the source is, because to blame economics as a discipline for the ills of the world, I think you're giving us too much credit. We're not that bad, but we're not that powerful either. But we also, nobody here, I think, will agree that we have monopoly over the solution to the world's problems. It might not happen in the economic sphere. There's political, there's medicine, there's physics, there's chemistry, there's social sphere. So I think the only reason economics, one of the reasons economics is being charged, the title of this panel is Rethinking Econ, so global challenges for the environment and society. It's because economics is the language of policy, because policy is all about making choices among competing needs. And so that's why we're charged with this, but we understand that, right? But let's just differentiate the economics as a discipline, from the economic system, And then I think there's a lot more commonalities among us in the stage.
I was just said, I mean, this is exactly why we're having these dialogues. So we can be constructive and learn from each other and understand our points of view, because at the end of the day is what matters more is how we can collaborate and how we can divide ourselves further. But having said that, Trish,
Okay, I'll kind of triangulate between those two. Because I think I agree with a lot of what was said. And I think that fundamentally economics is a study of human decision-making in the world that exists, where there are ties between people, both social and through markets. I think that economics as a discipline has focused primarily, or at least, at a base level, there's a lot of focus on markets and prices as an organizing principle for human decision-making and networks. I think that focus sometimes, like when you focus solely on markets and the idea of an externality, it's just external to the price. It doesn't mean it's external to decision-making. You're welcome to pay extra for anything to get the, upgraded environmental friendly version. But the focus on price and the focus on markets as an organizing principle in economics and the ties to policy has created kind of a laser focus on price mechanisms as the solution, as the policy solution of choice. And when you study it, it's beautiful. Like I fell deeply in love with carbon taxes, like circa 2006 when I was just out of undergrad. Like I was passionate about these, and how it works out is so wonderful. And so like it seems like it is the best possible way to get the very most bang for your buck if you're trying to get protect the environment. However, that single-minded focus on price mechanisms ignores a lot of other limitations of policy. You notice the policy that we just got passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest, most significant climate policy we have ever gotten accomplished. It has no cap and trade. There's no carbon tax. It is incentives and subsidies. Yeah, it's looking at, in some sense, a price mechanism because you're subsidizing the things you want to see more of. But I think we lost a lot of ground by focusing so, just doggedly over how can we get a carbon tax? How can we get price cap and trade? So much of the environmental economics literature was focused on that. And in the meantime, I just wonder what would have happened if we had been thinking more about the political economy of the political reality that we are facing when it comes to getting policies accomplished. And if we were thinking more about the social ties that drive changes throughout a market, through the social ties of human beings, we might have come up with a broader slate of solutions, and we might have gotten these things done sooner. So I'm not blaming economists for not getting that carbon tax, way back when, but I think that sometimes that focus it might have been better if we had been expanded, if we'd expanded our focus and not focused so entirely on price mechanisms.
This is a wonderful dialogue. I don't know where to begin except to say that this quote is swirling around in my head from Joan Robinson, who was one of the star students of John Keynes. And she said, the purpose of studying economics is to avoid being deceived by economists. And I think about some of my own training and some of this laser focus on the individual and how I've come to learn that maybe it's misplaced. It crowds out other motives, it crowds out other solutions, it crowds out other ethics and other instincts. So my journey into kind of deconstructing economics and then kind of rebuilding it again is to realize that economic thinking is always a reflection of a society's values. So if we're building an economics that is centered on the individual, centered on consumption, is centered on value as market exchange, then we've done a good job. But if we feel like in the 21st century or in 2023, we need to build an economics that is more relational, that is built on another set of ethical values and principles, that is less focused on individual action, more on collective choice, then we might want to try different flavors of economics, right? Or different alliances with other fields. And so that's kind of what brought me to ecological.
Yeah, Trisha, when you brought up the carbon taxes and cap and trade, I resonated with that because that's also what I learned during my master's program in environmental economics. And the math is beautiful. Like you just get this number and you think, oh, let's implement this carbon tax and everything will be fine. But I wanted to raise the issue of uncertainty because when you actually go into practice, so all of these models estimate damages from different climate events or as temperatures increase or if there's a climate disaster or hurricane. But the way that we think of these events is very different from the normal sort of economic thinking because of the high the probability of these events is low, but the damages are high and it's hard to estimate them because it's unknown. It hasn't happened before. So estimating those damages is unknown. It could be in terms of damage to your infrastructure, health, and so many major consequences. So when we think about climate or even, I guess, financial crises, there's so much uncertainty. Would anybody like to comment on that?
Can I comment on that?
I'm gonna comment briefly. So life is uncertainty. And I'm gonna just suggest a different tack, if I might, from what Donna and Trisha were describing with regard to the notion of scarcity and human choices. I think in reality that so many people lack choices that they have no choice at all. And that we forget that many people, in fact, are not able to make decisions about their economic lives, whereas others have disproportionate ability to exercise their choices and limit the opportunities of others. So I approach economics differently. I think John and I are very close in this. I think of economics as how do we support human well-being, broadly construed well-being, not just how much we can consume, but our relationships, certainty. How do we develop resilient systems in a world in which there is uncertainty? So I would just say I conceptualize it entirely different. And what are our systems that provide for a buffer in hard economic times or when there's a natural disaster? How do we support people to do well in that? I'm more focused on that and institutions that would do that than what a lot of economics gets into, and which drives a lot of good people away from economics, is trying to quantify really deep human relationships and ecological relationships that are hard to put a monetary value on. I think if the frame were well-being and how we promote that, this is what human beings need. Human beings need, they need to be able to provide for themselves and their families and loved ones with economic dignity and economic security in a way that is in good relationship with the planet. So starting from that framework, how do we then build a system that does all of those things?
Can I contribute to all of the things that he said? I really like the relational and social aspects that you guys have talked about. So just to clarify, the individualistic, the assertion that economics, or at least what they call mainstream economics, focus on the individual, is not because of the selfish nature that we're trying to promote on how we make decisions. The reason the individual is chosen as a representative individual, it can be a person, it can be a firm, it can be a household, is because that's the target of policy, right? We can say that we want as a society to electrify and to behave in a socially efficient manner that's best for everybody. But at the end of the day, the target policy is individual. And so I just wanted to clarify that economics should not be misconstrued as individual centric in that sense of being selfish, but individual centric because we identify, we realize, recognize that individuals make choices. But that is not to say that we cannot improve our social relationships so that when we make those individual choices, we're accounting for other people's welfare as well. And so that is where in economics, you can always design your objective function to include all these other concerns and priorities that you might have, or you can constrain yourselves in so many other ways. But that is not to say I'm always pushing for a carbon tax, because in the notion of uncertainty, Martin Weitzman, in his seminal article, Prices versus Quantities, basically, when you have marginal damages that we would observe for climate change, where it's much, much steeper, it will have very vertical portions of the marginal damage curve, what they would actually recommend is a quantity instrument rather than a price instrument. They would recommend a cap and trade system, because that in essence is really a quantity instrument. So it's not always that economists are always unable to deal with uncertainty in damages. The recommendation, Martin Weitzman, is really a cap and trade system. The economic aspect of it comes from the trading part, so that we're not just addressing environmental performance, achieving environmental targets, we're doing it in a cost-effective manner for the firms that are regulating, because heaven knows they're going to pass that cost to us, right? So I just wanted to say that, yes, it's probably not the way other people would think about uncertainty, the other fields, but mainstream economics do have the tools for that, both in terms of financial risk and uncertainty, but also in terms of damages, what would minimize efficiency, or what would maximize efficiency and minimize deadweight losses would be a cap and trade system. But again, the relational values, behavioral economics, and all that about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations and how we deal with others and social, I think that's really important, because there's a lot of studies right now talking about the salience of a carbon tax, like how people respond differently to a price change due to the tax versus a price change exclusive of the tax. And so that is key to behavioral economics. And that's just one way of mainstream economics trying to incorporate all these other fields that are growing right now, psychology for one. And so, yes, we probably have not perfected it in the way other fields would like, but that's why we're here trying to talk about it. So we wanted to see parallels and where our overlaps are, and where we can make room for each other, and where the improvements can be made.
Which is, I would just add that one of the issues that when we think about a carbon tax, for example, is, okay, you have a carbon tax of, I guess, Uruguay has like 100, I think it's 130 or 120. It's one of the most expensive ones right now. They also have a very small population, but the issue comes down also, like, how is that gonna be like carried on to the consumer, right? The inequality aspect. So how could we address something like that in maybe like behavioral economics?
So I'm still talking about carbon taxes. So I think, well, I mean, first of all, you can recycle the revenues. You can use all the revenues from a carbon tax and send them back in a form of a check to people. You can base that on income. And in fact, I think that's been enacted in British Columbia. But to come back to Rebecca's point, and also to, I'm glad that Marty already got a shout out. Marty Weitzman, who, is an amazing economist, and I had the honor to be his teaching assistant and work with him when I was in grad school. So in his later work, he focused a lot on the question of uncertainty, and the fact that, normally we think about uncertainty in terms of normal distributions. Well, what if the distributions aren't normal? What if like the entire obliteration of the planet is now like in the possibility of our future trajectory? When you throw infinity into math, things get weird. And Marty used to talk about how all these different aspects of climate change would just push economic tools to the breaking point. And he would talk about how if you're looking at a fat tail scenario, which means that those really, really, really terrible outcomes are like more than impossible, like they are, possible outcomes where we look at these extraordinarily terrible, life-altering, planet-altering, we're already life-altering, planet-altering, but let's say obliterating, to be dramatic. So if the potential costs go to infinity, then what does that do to the price? The optimal price will also go to infinity. And I remember, Rob Mendelsohn kind of arguing with Weitzman about this and saying, well, that's ridiculous. So we can't use that distributional curve. But I think another take is that you can change, if you change the way you're looking at what is possible, if the math changes underneath and you really pay attention to that instead of saying, well, let's just ignore that, it opens up different ways of looking at policy, and it opens up different policy mechanisms. So Marty Weitzman and along with that, Bruno Wagner, who's a phenomenal economist at Columbia, and worked with Marty a lot. They talked a lot about thinking of climate policy as insuring against these downside risks. So, instead of trying to find that optimal policy, how much should you invest in mitigation and adaptation to ensure against these extreme risks? Because the normal cost benefit analysis breaks down when you bring in infinity. So I think that that's a different way of looking at things that opens up different possibilities and kind of changes the conversation in a way that is useful. And there's more policy options to ensure against.
I would just say that this conversation is great. I mean, this is exactly why we're having this today. But I know we people might want to ask questions. So, and then you can include some of your comments in there. So if anyone, I think somebody was raising their hand over here first. Okay, 1 second. Let us get you a microphone. Yeah.
Is that all right? Oh, that isn't cool. I think maybe I'm misinterpreting this, but it was mentioned that neoclassical wasn't intrinsically selfish, and I don't exactly remember the argument for that, but isn't it by definition like the optimization of an individual through maximum maximum output through minimal input for an individual is kind of how neoclassical is like designed. So isn't that intrinsically selfish if like a person is trying to maximize what they get with doing as little as possible? But doesn't that like by definition, isn't that what selfishness is?
I would say yes. And I think another way to frame it is to say that it really that the individual in that case is self-regarding, and it doesn't leave any space for a person to be other regarding, right? So you optimize for yourself, but you're not taking into consideration the impact of your decision on the people around you that you're interacting with.
I could just add one quick comment on that. So economics is very much focused on the satisfaction of individual preferences. And really, I would argue it uses methodological individualism and prioritizes the individual. I would argue that humans are the most social animal here. For any of you that breakfast today, you depended on tens of thousands of people, but on knowledge accumulated over thousands of years by billions of people. We can't feed ourselves. A human can't live separate from society any better than a cell can survive separate from the body. We are using individual choice to deal with problems like climate change and biodiversity. These are collective action problems. Trying to boil it down to the individual is absurd. Externalities are externalities because they're impacts outside the scale of the decision maker, which if we're dealing with climate change, that means the decision maker can't be the individual. It has to be the collective. We need an economics that focuses on the collective nature of the challenges we face. And these are known as social dilemmas in which self-interest undermines the, if everybody cooperates, social well-being is maximized, but the individual always has an incentive that affect. And we can't focus on individual choice to deal with that type of problem.
You can model in economics however the individual makes decisions and whatever goes into his utility function. It can be his own objectives only, his own output, his own happiness, but you can also, and we know everyday life, we regard other people's welfare as well, our own families, our kids, our grandparents. There's nothing inherent in economics that says we have to only maximize individuals. As I said, the reason it's being used is at the end of the day, we target individual behavior as much as we want to collectively agree as a society. I don't think we can trust ourselves to have a governor or a mayor tell us what we're going to do collectively. We can collectively change minds, but we have to go out there and actually purchase that electric car and actually get solar panel. So I think what the misrepresentation is that in economics, we're social beings, right? We're very complicated. You can't model us very simply. So we use a lot of stylized models. And so what you guys would probably see if you've only taken Econ 11 or 12 is very simple models. Take an individual maximizing his utility, partaker for maximizing his profit. We always want to do that at the least resources possible, but that's not saying our utility is only a function of our own happiness. So there's a lot of work already in economics with social welfare, with environmental quality being part of that utility function, with overlapping generations model, talking about intertemporal decision-making. It's part of economics, but to misrepresent it that way, I think we're missing the point of where it's all about trying to recognize those trade-offs. And sometimes really not perfectly, we cannot always convince other people to do what we want them to do. But that's where that's what they're saying, is that societal, a sense of society is really needed, right? We're all social beings, we do that. But are we really going to, what do I say, vilify people who don't have solar panels and who don't drive electric cars? They're operating, right? Are we doing that? Are we all renting from landlords who have solar panels only? Are we evil? But that's what I'm saying. We're not selfish. We're operating within our private resource constraints. We're just rational. But that's not saying you don't want to do it. I know you want to do it. You're here in this room, for crying out loud, right? And so I guess the question, you have to hold our feet to the fire. So what do we do? How do we operationalize your ideas about making people think collectively? And that's what's consistent with what I'm saying earlier. It might not be happening in the economic sphere. We might need politicians here. It might be happening elsewhere. And maybe this is not rethinking economics, it has to be rethinking our whole economic system and the way we structure society and the way we regard others. I think you're putting too much in econ to say we're going to be solving all the problems. But that's just.
Yeah, so I think the nice thing about preferences and the nice thing about, when you're trying to come up with a utility function to maximize, to explain someone's choices, is that you can really throw anything you want in there if you're thinking about how is this person making a decision. So other regarding preferences and, other pro-environmental preferences, that's not always done, and certainly not at an intro level. The thing I think that we have missed, that this kind of collective action problem and kind of understanding and really thinking deeply about us as a social species, is that the preferences themselves are formed in a society where we're all impacting one another. So when policies are modeled using standard economic model, even if we do say, okay, this person cares about the environment, this person cares about other people, what we're not seeing is how does that policy actually change the preferences of the people who we are studying? So for example, like if you have a policy that puts in bike lanes and you only count the number of people who currently bike to work in terms of who gets the benefits, well, you're going to underestimate the benefits of that policy because you haven't accounted for all the people who, once they see other people out there biking, they're going to go, oh, biking, that's a good idea. Let's do that, or they're going to change their ideas about how safe it is based on the infrastructure. So sometimes these dynamic impacts that where the policy circles back to the preferences, that's where I think is a new frontier of economics. And, it's called endogenous preferences. It's a really cool idea, and it is starting to get into the fold as well. So I think, economics, you can look back at how it was 30 years ago, how some of it still very much is. And then there's also all these frontiers within the field that, I don't know what to call each of those frontiers. I'm not so into the labels, but there's different kinds of work happening that accounts for this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, in terms of next steps, how could a student become more involved or engaged with the chapter?
Okay, yeah, we'll answer those questions after. Thank you so much for your interest. Right now, we're running out of time, but we're trying to get some questions about how the faculty perceive some of the issues that you care about.
I wonder how much the panel considers the waste stream, America's horrific waste stream, as an influence on economics. It's untapped piles, mountains of garbage that we call landfills, and like dumpsters of vegetables that get turned to compost. So I just wonder how much that plays a part.
Well, one quick comment on that. I tend to talk too much, so I don't want to hog the thing, but in ecological economics, we don't look at inputs and outputs in an economy. We look at throughputs. We know that It takes raw materials and energy to create economic products, which always return to the ecosystems as waste. And we can never separate the two. So accounting for the waste has to be an integral part of every economic decision. And yet again, in most economics, it's considered an externality. Oh. But it takes huge amounts of energy to process that abundance. And we've often found that you use less energy to make plastic from oil than to recycle plastic.
Yeah, two words, search costs. So it's definitely possible, but those are the costs involved. Search costs. How long does it take to find those things that you need?
Yeah, can we actually take 2 or 3 questions at a time and then we can.
Hi. Is it okay? It's working. I was wondering what you guys think of pushing for resilient economic systems and doing that in conjunction with development of sustainable, both environmentally and socially beneficial economies, and then specifically looking at how with businesses as an entity and policy interact to actually have beneficial outcomes.
Can we get one more question as well?
I was wondering what the panel thought about the ability of our modern economy to potentially decouple carbon emissions from GDP growth. If that's possible or desirable.
I wanted to ask a question about the housing crisis in Burlington. And so according to the Vermont Digger, Vermont has the second highest per capita rate of unhoused individuals in the country. And there have been a lot of recent rent hikes. And it doesn't have to be limited to housing, but I was wondering how you've applied your work in field of research to solving problems here in Vermont.
Okay, I can jump in on a couple of these questions. In terms of the waste streams, in terms of resilience, in terms of decoupling, I think these all point to what kind of economics do we want in the 21st century? What kinds of priorities do we want in that kind of economics, right? How is our economics a expression of the challenges that we face today, not the challenges from the 19th century? And so I think of economics that today needs to be a kind of late successional economic, post-growth economics, a post-industrial economics. The kind of economics that we teach and preach in most of our classes and nearly all of our economics textbooks really is kind of early successional economics, where the focus is on competition, where the focus is on resource scarcity, where the focus is on individualism, right? What we've been talking about. If you think of an ecosystem as an economy, as any ecosystem in the late successional stages of an ecosystem, the focus shifts away from growth and towards resilience, away from competition and towards cooperation, right? Away from a society of winner takes all to a society of shared well-being. So, as I said earlier, to me, economics, how it's taught and how it's practiced is an expression of a society's values. And so much of what you're hearing today is, are we making that pivot? You know, are we keeping up with the life and times of our citizens? Is our economics reflective of a society of 8 billion people, or are we still stuck in a world where we think we only have 1 billion and the goal is to sort of, mirror an American lifestyle? This comes right down to like decoupling, right? I mean, I was in some research that I did for a recent book of mine, I was floored that all 116 scenarios that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change models that gets us to a 2 degrees Celsius threshold, which is what all the world's governments have agreed to, that we have to stay within. All of them assume a 2 to 3% global GDP growth rate. That's a doubling of the world economy every 26, 27 years. How they do this is through this sort of mantra from heaven of efficiency and technology and carbon capture and all of this kind of unproven stuff that there is no historical record that we could decouple like this. And the most honest assessments going forward say we can't decouple like this. How is it that those models come to those conclusions? Well, they are based on a representative individual. They are based on an agent. They are based on a kind of assumption that technology can substitute for nature, that technology can substitute for work, that technology can substitute for just about anything. And so we kind of create these models that work really well at the margin, the next choice, which is what economics was designed to be, like a science of next choice. But they really fall apart when you start to bring in irreversibilities, when you bring in uncertainties, when you bring in the accumulation of all those choices into an outcome that none of us ever would have voted for, what we sometimes call the tyranny of small decisions. And so I think as much as we're talking about what economics can do, I hope you're also hearing what economics can't do, right? Where are the limits to economic thinking? I'm a big fan of economics. I did a PhD in economics. I believe that economists can contribute as mechanics, as janitors, as fixers of the economy, of the market, but where we should not be trusted is as global planners, as worldview providers, as the next kind of, social messiah. So I say economic worldview, economic methods and tools, sure. If that makes sense.
If someone could just answer the question about housing, I mean, that really is affecting most of us.
So I could, last semester we did a course on the commons, which included the housing commons. And, one of the goals is one of my grad students is working on this and how do we deal with this problem? The overwhelming view is that it's a lack of supply. And yet, as we learned in our course, we have more second homes in Vermont than any other state than Maine. The number of second homes is growing. As people buy more second homes here, the demand for homes goes up, so the price of homes goes up. So buying homes here looks more attractive than investing in the stock market, in this positive feedback loop that sends prices so high that the average person can't afford a house. So grad students spend 57% of their income on homes. And then we have like Powell says, well, the solution to inflation is to raise interest rates, and that will drive down demand. Unfortunately, it also drives up the cost of building new houses. So what we're doing is we're decreasing demand and supply at the same time. Whereas one of the things that came out of our class is if you tax the value of land separate from the buildings on it, then the parking lot on College Street will pay the same tax as the 5-story apartment building, and the owner of that parking lot can't afford to pay it. So he's going to build or she's going to build a 5-story apartment building that will house a lot more people and drive down rent. But the big thing is the speculators who buy the homes driving up their prices for everybody, and they don't even live here. So that's a
So just briefly, what underlies this is the problem of inequality. During COVID, very wealthy families from New York, New Jersey, and so forth are buying second, third homes up here. In fact, the percentage is 25% of homes in Vermont are second homes to somebody. In addition, because of the growth of inequality, wealth holders and hedge funds are investing in housing and flipping it and speculating. So the solution in part is to address once again the problem of inequality. We see it reverberate in housing and healthcare system and education system and so forth, but the overarching problem is the problem of inequality. And I think it's just important to understand that these are policy choices. The failure to address this is a choice. And it is because of the powers that dominate in our economic system are more concerned with the wealth of the dominant group than of people who are unable to meet the basic need of housing. But these are eminently solvable problems.
We have time for a few more questions.
Hi, Stephen Marshall. Couple of comments were made earlier that I really would like to respond to. One is the definition of economics as study of allocation of scarce resources. And instantly what came up in my mind was, what if we decided, no, we're not going to worry about that. Let's worry about the allocation of resources to those who need them. Or say it differently, the fair distribution of resources. What if economics was about the fair distribution of resources? It would just be a different science, right? But can you imagine the world we would live in if that was the defining characteristic of the economics that we study? The other thing, I'm afraid it's not going to come back to me. So that's it. Thank you.
A lot of people would argue that having out of staters is really important for Vermont's economy due to how much they bring in with tourism, especially for like during the ski season, ski resorts. What can be done to find a balance between encouraging out of staters to come and spend their money, but also supporting the Vermonters who actually live here and having them get their fair housing first?
Hi, I just have a quick question, or it's just a simple question. What has the predominance of finance in the last 50, some odd years done to your profession and the way economists think about the economy? Thank you.
So I guess my question this evening, we've heard that the language of policy is economics, right? So my question is that this new thinking that we are talking about this evening, how do we get them into policy? How does your work individually, do you think it influence policy? Because we can be talking about this at the academic level, but how do each of these new set of thinking influence policy? How are we training students to go into policy to really make the change? Because the only tool that I know that we can use to make this change is policy. So how is your work influencing policy? Thank you.
Would like to take.
I'm an environmental economist and I work on pollution regulation and incentives to adopt environmental innovations and environmental friendly technologies. So I'm using a lot of US EPA publicly available data sets that capture or that measure pollution levels of a lot of manufacturing utilities. So how is it relevant for policy? Is my work tends to can speak about how effective certain types of regulations are and how certain initiatives by firms themselves are actually greenwashing, or are they really effective in trying to improve environmental performance. And so that's one way to do this is I'm actually, writing on actual US EPA priorities and data sets. These are their priorities. This is what they're interested in. And so a lot of my work is trying to feed into the kind of regulations that they are using for the chemical industry and manufacturing industry. So that's where the niche of my work is, and also speak about whether it also pays for some firms to actually economically, I guess financially, whether it pays for them to actually do better environmental behavior or adopt this environmental technology. So that's in a limited sense, that's what I do. And also I deal a lot with regulation and enforcement, what works, what doesn't, and under what circumstances there's going to be non-compliance and so on and so forth. So just the gist of it.
That's great. I would just quickly add, as you answered those amazing questions, think about something that Jon Erickson recently wrote in his recent book, The Progress Illusion, about this radical pragmatism idea on where we have to like overcome the dichotomy between a state and market solutions. So, for example, I believe we can still use aspects of, and we have to, of environmental economics, but then also other aspects from other heterodox schools, right? So how do we, the whole point of the dialogue, right, is to like bring them together so we can fix problems together.
To speak briefly about the policy piece, it's a really great question. And just say when I first started out in graduate school studying economics, I was deeply frustrated at academics who talked to themselves but didn't actually share their knowledge or influence policymakers. And I think every single one of us up here is deeply engaged in policy. John, and I believe Josh worked on the genuine progress indicator for Vermont, which is a very different way of measuring well-being. I do a lot of work on gender inequality with the United Nations. And just to give you an example, we do have an impact. 25 years ago, there were huge gender inequalities in access to education, for example. That gap has almost been closed, and partly it's the result of the work that many of us have done to influence the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN, and so forth. But I would say fundamentally what is needed is for academics to also work with governments to change policy. I think all of us have testified in Montpelier and other places, and that I think is, you know, for me, that I feel that's part of my obligation as a professor at a publicly funded institution, is I'm funded by Vermonters, and I want to also use my expertise to inform legislators to make good decisions around policy. And I think I speak for all of us when I say that.
There was also a question on finance.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that, and also on policy. I mean, so policy, I love the focus on policy, but it is like, how do you prioritize your policy goals, right? And I would suggest that a policy goal for economics nowadays is not so much about the efficiency of the economy, but the size of the economy, the scale of the economy, right? How big should the economy be within a fixed Earth system? Then we can ask the question, how should we share in the benefits and burdens of that economy, to reflect Stephen's point? Then we can sort of find the role of the market within that, right? A kind of science-informed size of the economy and ethically informed distribution of the economy, and then an economics-informed efficiency of the economy. I think that's really important. What we've done, and for example, why finance has become so prioritized, is we've flipped that around, right? Everything is economics first, ethics second, scale or ecology last. And some of the best minds from our universities for the past 30 years have been just sort of sucked away from our economics programs into finance. And I think that's unfortunate. In doing research for this book, I realized that, you know, some of the Ivy League institutions had created this kind of Ivy League to Wall Street pipeline where, get this, 40% of graduates from Princeton were going directly to Wall Street from their undergraduate degree all throughout the late 80s and into the early 90s. And that just like blows me away. And so really talented folks being drawn into finance, right, to learn how to make money from money, and to really sort of perpetuate a disconnect from what I just said, disconnect from the ecological relationships, from the social relationships, and only focus on those kind of narrow economic relationships. The biggest sort of shout from Occupy Wall Street, and I was there, maybe others were, was this sort of taking back of power, the realization of too much power in the hands of too few people, right? The disconnect with how much power finance had, not only on Wall Street, but in our capitals, in Washington, DC in particular, right? so again, I sound like a broken record, I know, but economics and how it's taught and practiced is a reflection of society's values. And if we put the dollar as the kind of almighty at the top of the almighty altar, then you get a kind of economics that prioritizes finance. You get Nobel Prizes in financial economists, which is what happened in the early 90s. You get kind of an enveloping of the economic system around our social and environmental systems. You get the reduction of all social relationships to market logic. And I feel like that pendulum has swung that way so far in recent years that this rethinking economics is a reflection of sort of pulling it back to other kinds of things.
I would make one additional quick comment about finance. I'm not a Marxist theorist or anything, but Marx, argued that there was industrial capitalism where we focused on real production, and financial capitalism where we primarily purchased existing assets to watch them inflate in value and sell them for more than they cost when we bought them, which actually creates no new wealth. He bet that industrial capitalism was going to win out. I think it's overwhelmingly obvious that financial capitalism has won out. The financial sector now is, even look at, the idea of the stock market is people give money to a new corporation to give it money to invest in things. Right now, those corporations are borrowing money to buy back their own stocks. They're removing, there's less money to invest in real things because they're buying their own stocks. People are speculating wildly. And the financial sector always skims off the top when this happens, to the point where like 10% of the average person's income goes to pay interest. The prices we pay for every commodity we buy reflect the interest paid to the financial sector. I believe we have undergone revolutionary change in our economy through the financial sector. International currency trades are now like $7 trillion a day. It's like 20 something times the size of the global economy. Produces nothing of value. If I buy and sell the currencies are held on average for 30 seconds. Stocks now are held on average for 22 seconds. If you can explain to me how that contributes any wealth to our economy in a real form, please do so. But it does transfer wealth to those speculators and to the financial sector systematically.
Yeah, you're here. So I just want to speak to the question of, if you are studying economics or if you're not studying economics, how do you have an impact on policy? How do you have an impact on these problems? And I think first is understand the problem, but don't stop there. I think a lot of students spend a ton of time, and a lot of scholars, a lot of tenured professors spend so much time trying to understand every single aspect of the problem and write reams and reams of work on that. I think talking to people, you should try to do your homework, read what has been written, but talk to people on the ground, talk to people who have these problems, talk to people who are trying to solve these problems, and talk to the policymakers and ask them, what are the barriers? What are the barriers to solving this problem? What is the barrier to getting this policy passed? And what tools do you need? Because as economists, we're here with a bunch of tools. I don't know if we're using them in the best way. A friend of mine is a staffer, and he was working on the Inflation Reduction Act. He needed a tool, envision, here's what I need to do. Here's what I need this tool to be able to compare these different policy options and to use it in my negotiations. They scoured looking for all sorts of economists who could provide them with this analytical tool. And they're all like, yeah, we don't really do that sort of thing. That's not really our thing. And the fact that no one was producing these tools, it shows a disconnect. So I think talking to policymakers, talking to people, asking them what they need, asking them, how do we focus on these barriers, and then propose solutions, and importantly, show how they work and show how we get from point A to point B. And I know that's a huge task, and it can feel overwhelming, but just don't stop at, I don't want to say complaining about the problem, because it is very important to recognize all these problems that exist, but focus on solutions and providing tools to get over certain barriers. And that's where I think you can really have an impact. And it might not be economics that ends up being the thing. I mean, the other thing I teach is entrepreneurship. We have a person in the room thinking about the housing crisis and thinking about other barriers other than, other mechanisms of how to address problems. So think more broadly, talk across disciplines. Don't worry about whether or not your work is economics enough or is like accepted by other, economists who you're trying to impress. Maybe sometimes you have to do that, but focus on the solutions, and that's how you can have an impact.
I tend to agree. I agree with what everybody has said in terms of focusing on solutions. And I think Joshua and Stephanie and John they've really done a great job characterizing where the sources of problems are. So writing off what they said and what Trish said is, what are the solutions? So for you guys, right, when hold our feet to the fire when we do attend our classes, it's like, okay, that's a great idea. How you just characterize why housing is a difficult problem in Vermont. So what's the solution? And then don't shy away from the solutions that sometimes might be small and incremental and that you can do individually, because we're trying to solve the world's problems here. But before we can get these big systemic changes, we should not abandon the small ones that work, right? If there's a little carbon tax that might work, maybe you're going to cut back a little bit on your emissions, but that's not enough. I think we've agreed today that that's not going to solve everybody's problems. We're not going to tax our way into a cleaner environment, into solving climate change, right? Innovation is important in this way. We need to improve our social relationships. But I guess whenever we're thinking of these big things and these big systemic problems that we're all talking about here, don't shy away from the ones that already work, so that you're not abandoning one field of econ over another, because we are all thinking in a systemic fashion, but some already work. So let's not shy away. Don't let what's perfect be the enemy of the good, right? Don't let the big revolutionary changes that we envision for the climate, right, be the enemy of small incremental changes that we can do. Maybe buy an electric car this time for you, for your household. So that's what I'm saying. So there are things that can work individually. Just don't get discouraged, though, given our conversation today.
Yeah, well, this has been a fascinating well, there's one more. It's really pressing, but we're gonna let you do just one more. Yeah,
You were saying about looking to the groups that are talking about these things and proposing solutions and working on them. And I was going to mention that there are BIPOC-led groups and groups that are intentionally diverse, multiracially and multiculturally working against white supremacy culture. And for a better economics. And they're working with ideas such as public banking, participatory budgeting, community land trusts, agrarian trusts, different modes of being in relationship to the land and relationship to people through the sharing economy. I don't know that anyone else does it in their classes, but I think the geography professor Ingrid Nilsson applies feminist economics to her course design so that students achieve grades through collective and relational relationships rather than through individual learning, but through collective action. So that's actually implementing kind of a relational values system of kind of a care economy of these feminist economics principles around caring for each other. And these things that we talked about, like carbon taxes and the Inflation Reduction Act, have been opposed by environmental justice groups. The Black-led groups have called it anti-Black. The Indigenous Environmental Network has said that it is not a climate bill. I think every single environmental justice group that is BIPOC-led, that is intentionally multiracial, has opposed the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's really worth looking and seeing what these groups are saying. And a lot of these groups are saying that they do not want a global economy. They want a pluriverse. And so I think Pablo Escobar, who writes about pluriversal economies and cultures, came to UVM, I think, while I was out of town a year or two ago and spoke about these sorts of ideas. And in April, there is a decolonizing economics conference. That's the 2 days, like April 20th, 21st, 22nd, online and in person. It's like $25 minimum contribution to register, but it's being sponsored by the California Faculty Association, by the US Solidarity Network, by the public banking groups, by all these groups that are working at the cutting edge of alternative economics thinking and practice, like actually, working with public budgeting implementation in various cities And I find some of that very exciting.
Well, thank you so much for that comment. Honestly, this has been a great dialogue, discussion of this amazing faculty that we've had here. I think some of the main takeaways are that we agree more than we disagree. And what matters about having these dialogues and these discussions is that we can learn from each other, get people to sit on the table, because some of the times, even grad students and faculty are isolated, or because of the way the system is, the academic system. So we gotta find ways to break away from that, and that's why Rethinking Economics exists. And yeah, let's overcome that the dichotomy between state and market solutions, so we can learn from each other. And I appreciate everyone coming here today. We'll be sending you an email for those who wanted to be part of Rethinking Economics, to let you know more events that will be coming up and how you can get involved. And if you have any questions that weren't answered here and you would like to have other panels like this in the future, we can hopefully organize them, even though they take massive amounts of time and effort. But I think it's all worthwhile so that we can achieve our Rethinking Economics. Thank you.
And let's hear it for Rigo and Rubina and the other Rethinking Economics group for doing all this. It's a huge initiative, huge amount of work taking away from their dissertation. But
and yes,
we appreciate
the one last thing is that all these people here, Chris, Lucio, Juliana, Dakota, Danish, Catherine is here, Amber is here too. I'm not sure if Logan is here, but many others that might be missing. But all these, it took a village to get this organized. So I really appreciate it, everyone, and we'll continue to do this.